I'll actually touch on both the Fed and the RBA because they both provided significant news this week. And I think it's because they're facing a similar, not the same, but a similar problem. Jay Powell's problem that he's facing is that he may have to put up interest rates by more than he previously anticipated. And the reason he may have to do that is because as the previous US Congress, headed by Nancy Pelosi, was going out the door, they added very significantly to US government spending. Up until about 4 months ago, I thought we were looking at budget deficits for the US of between 2 and 3% of GDP for the balance of this decade. The average long-term US budget deficit is 2.2% of US GDP. But because of additional spending, the budget deficit for the US this year is now estimated to be 5.3% of US GDP, and the budget deficit for next year is now estimated to be 6% of GDP. If you do that in a circumstance where you've got the lowest unemployment since the 1970s, or in fact in the US case, since the late 1960s, that's really inflationary. And that means that extra spending has to be countered by higher interest rates. And that's what motivates Jay talking about putting interest rates higher. Already, they were going to put up rates to between 5 and 6%. But I think that in later this month, when we get the summary of economic projections come out from the Fed at the Fed meeting, we'll be talking about the higher end of 5 to 6% rather than the lower end of 5 to 6%. In that circumstance, very interestingly, Philip Lowe, PhD, the governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, suggested that we might consider pausing the increase in interest rates. Now, on the face of it, that's really surprising because if we look at where US core inflation is, this is say the core CPI less food and energy. The most recent figure in January for the US is an inflation rate, core inflation rate of 5.6%, and the Fed already has a short rate of 4.6%, a Fed funds rate of 4.6%, which is 1% lower than that. And it's reasonable to expect that if inflation falls a little bit more, then the Fed funds rate might go up to where inflation is. That would make a lot of sense. Great play was made by the Australian media of Mr. Philip Lowe, PhD, talking about the decline in the monthly CPI in Australia. The core CPI, the same, the CPI less food and energy in Australia, fell from 8.1% in January to 8.1% in December to 7.2% in January. Okay, so I've just said that right now the core CPI in the US is 5.6% and our core CPI is 7.2%. Our inflation rate's way higher than the US. Why would we be thinking of perhaps pausing interest rates? Well, right now we are in the pre-budget time for the Australian government. The budget deficit that we're looking at is 3% of GDP this year and 2.6% of GDP next year, better than in the US. Maybe the government can tighten up that budget deficit a bit more. And maybe if that government tightens up that budget deficit a bit more, then the RBA won't have to put interest rates up so high. Same kind of balancing act. But here, I think what's actually happening is in the background that Philip Lowe, PhD, might be saying to the government, well, if you reduce the budget deficit, we mightn't have to put up interest rates as high as we previously thought we would. I'm just suggesting that as a possibility. But I think that right now we're way behind where the US in terms of interest rates are. And I'll stick to my view that the Australian cash rate has to wind up at the end of this year at 4.85%, which I think by that time will be a full percent lower than where the Federal Reserve is likely to go, because their budget deficit will still be bigger than ours will be.